hanging as a barrier. Now, I think you would agree with me that men and women today who are on any kind of religious quest are similar to those Jews at the time of Calvary. If you talk with people who are interested in religious things, in spiritual things, whose hearts are inclining them in a search for God, you will find that they are not dissimilar to the Jews at that time, because they've got the notion that there is something behind there. They will say that kind of thing to us. They say, well, I know there has to be something. I know there has to be a reality. I know that we're not all here by chance. That there is some hidden power behind the world as they see it. But what is it? And that is the haunting uncertainty with which they rise in the morning and go to bed at night. That is the perpetual frustration. And so the seeking soul says, well, there must be something behind all of this. Perhaps it is a living mind. I don't know what that might mean. Or an austere righteousness. Or maybe all that I can hope to meet is some kind of heedless indifference. Or a heartless, inconsequential prime mover. Those of you who have had to do Thomas Hardy in English literature, who've done The Mayor of Casterbridge or Far from the Madding Crowd or Tess of the D'Urbervilles, will have been struck by the way in which so much of Hardy's literature turns on the apparently inconsequential, turns on a very significant letter being put under a very significant door to be given to a very important person, but the letter goes under the carpet. And the important person behind the door never gets the letter. And the whole drift of the novel from that point out is radically altered by that. Hardy in those moments is declaring his worldview. In his poetry he makes it clear. In the Dynasts, speaking of God, he refers to him blasphemously as the dreaming, dark, dumb thing that turns the handle of this idle show. The dreaming, dark, dumb thing that turns the handle of this idle show. And many of our friends with whom we will rub shoulders again tomorrow, who are on a religious quest, are largely right there with Hardy. If there is something somewhere turning the handles of this strange puppetry, then I need to find out what it is. And the tragedy is even greater than that, because men and women wander out of churches, yes, even churches like this, wondering all the time, if there is this God, can I pray to him? Does this God know the miseries of men? Does he understand the heartache of the world? Can he give me forgiveness and hope when I've done something that makes me hate myself and leaves me feeling so horribly guilty? And the answer, of course, is yes. And the reason we know is because the curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. This was an event. It was a unique, historical, God-ordained event in a moment in time. The prophets had led up to it. Christ in his words had anticipated it, but now in a moment God breaks into time, space, and in the death of his Son declares the way open for men and women. The Jews had it all exclusively wrapped up. They knew that if anybody was going in there, they were going in there, but nobody else was going in there. And God said, watch this, and he tore the curtain apart. And he said, everyone can go in there. Jew and Gentile, barbarian, Scythian, slaves, free people, black people, white people, Chinese people. All may come. Now let me just make a couple of points by way of application here. First of all, to those of us who understand something of the implications of this, that God, in tearing down the curtain, whereby people were shut out and he was shut in, declared the way open for men and women to come to him. Let me say this to us. Isn't it a dreadful tragedy when we, who are now the followers of this God and the servants of this Christ, when we erect restrictions and fresh barriers that make it difficult for our friends and neighbors to encounter the Lord Jesus Christ? When we begin to put up our own little curtains and our own little barriers and make people cross all kinds of cultural chasms in order to meet Christ. When we suggest to them that if they were to meet Christ, then they're supposed to become like us. That's why in Africa you had that dreadful colonialism and imperialism and all those wonderful African people with all those fantastic clothes and those super drums and those wonderful instruments. They're all singing out of Sankey's hymn book and wearing three-piece suits. Why? Because the missionaries got the culture rolled in with a message. And they told the people, you need to become like us if you're going to follow him. That's the wrong way around, folks. The invitation by means of the torn curtain is that all may come directly to Christ and he'll decide what he's going to do with them. We don't. And that's one of the reasons that people dislike church so much, incidentally. Because they figure they're going to have to end up like us and they don't really like us. Which is no surprise because some of us don't really like each other. So Jesus, if you like, makes a carpet out of the curtain. Tears the curtain down, makes it a carpet. That which was a barrier before is now a bridge. He says, walk over here and meet God. He's been doing that all the way down his line. That's what he said to Zacchaeus, and the Pharisees said, you can't say that to Zacchaeus. Don't you realize what a runt he is? And why are you hanging around with Mary Magdalene? Those are some bad women you're hanging with, Jesus. Don't you realize you're going around with the wrong people? And we watch Jesus through the Gospels, and we see him with the broken, and we see him with the burdened. We see him with the unfortunate. We see him with the disinherited. We see him making their troubles his troubles. We see him making their shame his shame. And we see him finally on the cross bearing sin in his own body on the tree. And in that moment of amazing divine transaction, the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. All of his life, he had belonged to sinners. It's hardly surprising then that when he died between two thieves. Isn't it interesting too that since only one person, namely the high priest, was able to go into the Holy of Holies once a year, and that after he had offered a sacrifice for his own sins, isn't it a dramatic irony that the one who was able to go behind the curtain was Caiaphas? It's time for us to declare to our world a religionless Christianity. One that is devoid of curtains and barriers and bells and smells and every other cultural gizmo we can come up with to make it difficult for people to understand the central issue of it all, that in God, Christ was reconciling the world to himself. When the writer to the Hebrews applies this, as I opened our worship with it in Hebrews chapter 11, I should say, he urges intimacy with God, and he urges intimacy with one another. And we know that, and we're familiar with that. But the thought that I want to leave with you and take with me tonight is simply this. Not that since the curtain has been torn, we are to hold fast to this and hold fast to one another and do all these other things. But since the curtain has been torn so wonderfully apart,